My son used my grief against me. Just weeks after my husband's funeral, he tricked me into signing away our entire $42 million empire, thinking I was too frail to notice. He treated me like a child, isolating me in my own home and telling everyone I was confused. He even called me a factor that was no longer important, all while secretly trying to cover his crimes with my money. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot that for 40 years I wasn't just a wife, I was my husband's partner. And I was about to give them the most public, humiliating lesson of their lives. A month after we buried my Richard, the silence in our Highland Park mansion was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It was an oppressive, heavy quiet that clung to the drapes and settled deep into the plush carpets. My son Noah and his wife Tiffany decided the best way to break it was with a luncheon for a few close friends. On the surface, it was a thoughtful gesture. Noah played the part of the dutiful, grieving son to perfection, his arm always ready to steady me, his voice a low, respectful murmur. But I've always been an observant woman. It's a skill you learn when your husband builds a real estate empire from Texas dust. And I noticed things. I saw the way his knuckles were bone white as he gripped the stem of his wine glass, a tremor of tension running up his arm. I saw how beneath the polished mahogany of the dining table he would slide his phone onto his lap, his eyes darting down with a flicker of raw panic that was gone as quickly as it appeared. He was performing, and while everyone else gave him a standing ovation, I could see the sweat on his brow. In the days that followed that luncheon, Noah's concern began to feel less like comfort and more like a cage. He initiated what he called a plan to help me rest and recover. It started when he let go of Maria, my housekeeper of 20 years. He told me it was too much for me to manage staff in my condition, that he and Tiffany would handle everything. Then came the phone. He had the old landline disconnected, explaining that the constant calls from well-wishers were just too stressful. He promised to screen all calls on his cell phone for me. He even started collecting the mail himself each morning, bringing me only a few curated letters and telling me the rest was just bills and business things I shouldn't have to worry my head about. Every move was framed as an act of protective love, but with each one, the walls of my own home seemed to creep closer. My world, once as expansive as the Texas sky had been, shrunk down to the rooms they allowed me to see. It was a gilded prison, and my own son was the warden. The real betrayal, the one that slit my heart open, came about a week later. He found me in the sunroom staring out at the wilting roses in Richard's garden. He was carrying a thick stack of documents an inch high at least, and he wore a smile that was all charm and no warmth. He told me they were just routine preliminary estate forms, a bit of paperwork, to help the probate process move along smoothly. His voice was a soothing balm of condescension, the tone one uses for a child or a simpleton. He sat beside me, spreading the papers across the table, and pointed to each signature line. I was so tired. The grief was a physical weight, a cloak of lead I couldn't shrug off. A part of me knew this was wrong, that Richard would have read every single line twice, but I just didn't have the fight in me. So I played the part he had cast for me, the confused, frail widow. I picked up the pen, and as he guided my hand to the first line, I signed, page after page, my signature, my consent given away until my wrist ached. I had just handed him the keys to Richard's entire legacy. That night, sleep was a stranger. The house was finally still, but my mind was racing. I got up and walked the halls, my hand trailing along the cool wallpaper, Richard's presence, a ghost in every room. As I passed his study, a sliver of light from under the door caught my eye. And then I heard Noah's voice. It wasn't the gentle, concerned tone he used with me. This was hushed, frantic, and sharp as broken glass. I leaned closer, my heart turning to ice. I heard him say the deadline was the audit, not a day later. He didn't care what had to be done, he just needed to keep the lenders calm. And then came the words that struck me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and shattering the last vestiges of my grief-numbed denial. He said my mother has signed everything. She's not a factor. Not a person, not his mother, a factor. Something to be managed and dismissed. In that moment, the grief didn't just fade. It was burned away by the cold, clear, horrifying reality of his betrayal. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just sat in the dark, the memory of Noah's cold, dismissive words replaying in my mind. He thought I wasn't a factor. The grief that had been a smothering blanket for a month was now a cold, sharp stone in my gut. By morning, I had a plan. The next afternoon, my old friend Mary came for a visit that Noah and Tiffany insisted on supervising. They sat in the adjoining parlor, the door left pointedly ajar so they could hear every word. I decided to use their surveillance against them. As Mary and I sipped our iced tea, I let a wistful expression cross my face. I told her how I'd been thinking about Richard so much and about all his little projects. Then I dropped the hook. I asked her in the most innocent, sentimental voice I could manage if her husband, who was on the board of directors, knew what was happening with Richard's old vanity project, that little commercial property over in the design district. I called it so sentimental and said I certainly hoped Noah wouldn't sell it off. I knew from years of listening to Richard that this was one of the few properties held without any partners, making it the perfect asset for a secret fraudulent loan. The effect was instantaneous. Tiffany burst into the room carrying a fresh tray of cookies she'd supposedly just baked. Her smile stretched so tight, it looked painful. She started chattering a mile a minute, talking right over me, asking Mary about her daughter's wedding plans, her voice a pitch too high. The subject was changed so clumsily, it was like watching a child try to hide an elephant behind a cocktail napkin. Later that afternoon, I heard them from my room, their voices a furious hissing whisper from downstairs. Noah was panicked, accusing Tiffany of not managing the visit properly. She was defensive, insisting she'd handled it. Their conflicting excuses about why the property was tied up in paperwork were all the confirmation I needed. They were not master criminals. They were scared, sloppy amateurs, and for the first time in a month, I felt a flicker of power. That evening, I told them I had a terrible headache and was going to bed early. The moment my bedroom door was shut, I went to the back of my walk-in closet. Behind a stack of old hat boxes was a small, prepaid burner phone Richard had given me years ago. He'd told me it was for a real emergency, a just-in-case measure. My hands trembled as I took it out, a fresh wave of grief hitting me. Not for his death, but for his foresight. He must have known on some level what our son was capable of. I powered it on and made a single call to Arthur Vance, our family lawyer for over 40 years, a man fiercely loyal and now semi-retired. When his gravelly voice answered, I kept it brief, my own voice a near whisper. I told him it was Charlotte and that Richard had been right to be worried. Then I said the 3 words that would change everything: I need you. He didn't ask questions. He just told me to stay put and stay quiet. I had an ally. Noah must have felt the ground shift beneath his feet because he acted fast. He came to me the next morning, his face a mask of false concern. He told me he was worried my grief was causing confusion and that my question to Mary had been inappropriate. From now on, he explained he would be handling all communications with friends and family to ensure there were no more unfortunate misunderstandings. Before I could even protest, He informed me a new security system was being installed that very day, complete with cameras in all the main areas of the house, for my own protection, of course. The pretense of care was gone. The oppression was no longer subtle. This was a declaration of war. Standing there listening to him detail the ways he would be sealing me off from the world, I understood with chilling clarity that I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance anymore. I was fighting for my freedom. When my son declared war, I knew I couldn't win with a frontal assault. He had the youth, the legal documents I'd foolishly signed, and the element of control. So I did what he and his father never thought I was capable of. I executed a strategic retreat. I leaned into the role he'd written for me. I became the frail, confused widow. The next morning, I let Tiffany help me choose a dress, claiming my eyes were too blurry to see the colors properly. I would ask Noah the same question 3 times in an hour, then apologize profusely for my forgetfulness. I let him make every decision from what I'd have for lunch to when I should take a nap. I could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes. He and Tiffany would exchange little glances, relieved that my spark of defiance had been nothing more than a final confused flicker before the flame went out completely. They were so sure they had won. In the quiet moments when I was supposed to be napping, I would lie in bed and piece together the story of how my son had come to this. It wasn't just greed. I knew him better than that. It was weakness. I could practically hear the arguments he must have had with Richard over the past few years. Noah always chasing the next big thing, the flashy tech startups and risky ventures, while Richard, a man who built his empire on solid Texas soil, would refuse to fund his foolishness. I pictured the disastrous investments collapsing, the crushing weight of debt, and the shame of having failed to live up to his father's legacy. And then, Richard's sudden death. It must have felt like a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. The desperate forgery of the will, the frantic search for lenders who wouldn't look too closely. It was all a frantic scramble to cover his failures. His arrogance wasn't strength. It was a thin, brittle shield for the abject terror of a boy who was about to be exposed. My opportunity came a week later. Noah and Tiffany were attending a society gala, a chance for him to perform his new role as the head of the family empire. The moment their car pulled away, I went to work. Richard's study was the heart of the house, and now it was ground zero. The new security panel Noah had installed beeped menacingly, but Richard had always been a man of contingencies. I typed in an old override code he had set years ago, a sequence of our anniversary and birthdays. The light turned green. Inside, I went straight to the large oak bookshelf and pushed on a specific carved panel. A section of the shelves swung inward, revealing a hidden safe. Inside was not just jewelry or cash, but Richard's true emergency kit, a sleek, encrypted laptop, a hardbound ledger detailing every real company asset, and a sealed envelope containing his true original will. For the next 3 hours, I was not a frail old woman. I was my husband's wife, his partner. I communicated with Arthur through a secure messaging app on the laptop, sending him photos of the ledger and the will. I used Richard's meticulous notes to trace the tendrils of Noah's lies, cross-referencing company accounts with the public records of his shell corporations. The web was deep, but it was also carelessly woven. Just as I was packing everything away, a new message from Arthur popped up on the screen. It seemed Noah, bloated with arrogance and convinced of his total victory, had made a fatal mistake. He had formally initiated the sale of the Design District property, the very asset I had asked Mary about. He was so desperate to pay off his most aggressive creditor that he'd rushed the paperwork. In doing so, he created a fresh digital paper trail, a blazing arrow that pointed directly from the fraudulent loan application he'd used to his own personal accounts. He had completely underestimated me, and in his hubris, he had just handed me the weapon I would use to burn his whole deceitful world to the ground. The next morning, the house was quiet. Noah came down late looking smug and a little worse for wear after his night of celebration. He was acting like the king of a country he'd just conquered, and I was merely a piece of old decorative furniture. He had no idea that his kingdom was a house of cards, and a hurricane was just pulling up to the curb. I had spent the night preparing communicating with Arthur on the encrypted laptop, coordinating our strike down to the minute. The plan was in motion. Just before noon, I saw Arthur's familiar figure walking not to the front door, but through the garden gate. I had left it unlocked for him. He let himself in, gave me a single determined nod, and walked straight to Richard's study, where Noah was taking a business call as if he owned the place. I followed and stood in the doorway a silent witness. Arthur didn't waste time with pleasantries. He strode to the desk and laid a sheaf of legal documents down with a heavy thud. He informed Noah that it was an emergency injunction signed by a judge less than an hour ago, freezing all company assets pending a full audit. He read the grounds aloud, his voice like rolling thunder in the quiet room, evidence of gross financial mismanagement and potential fraud. Noah's world didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, terrified mask. The legal authority of the document, the irrefutable power in Arthur's stance, it all broke him. The facade of the powerful heir, the charismatic Dallas businessman, evaporated in an instant. All that was left was a terrified man-child on the verge of tears. His eyes darted around the room and landed on me standing in the doorway. I wasn't playing the part of the frail widow anymore. I met his gaze with all the cold, hard strength he never knew I possessed. And he just confessed. It wasn't an apology. It was a pathetic, desperate torrent of self-pity and blame. He sobbed about how his dad had pushed him too hard, how the market had turned against him, how his investments had failed. He even had the audacity to claim he was only trying to protect me, that he'd done it all for the family. Tiffany, who had heard Arthur's booming voice and followed him inside, stood frozen just behind me. She heard every last word of Noah's blubbering confession. The horror on her face was absolute. She wasn't a master conspirator. She was a greedy, weak-willed enabler who had hitched her wagon to a man she thought was a winner. The reality of his criminality, the sheer depth of his lies, was more than she could handle. When Noah sobbed that he'd even forged the will, she whispered a single horrified question, asking if he'd really forged a will. Then she took a deliberate step back away from him, as if he were diseased. His final alliance had just crumbled to dust. That's when I took control. I walked into the room, my back straight, my voice clear and steady, and utterly devoid of the weakness he had counted on. I looked down at my son, a broken man, drowning in the consequences of his own making. I told him the board of directors would be meeting the next morning at 10 o'clock. I told him that he would be there, and I told him that he would explain to them, just as he had explained to me, exactly what he had done to his father's company. He just stared up at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, the kind you feel when you realize the person you dismissed as a factor has become your judge, jury, and executioner. His fate was now entirely in my hands. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I dressed not in the muted colors of a widow, but in a sharp navy blue suit Richard had always loved. Arthur picked me up, and we drove to the downtown office building that housed my husband's empire. We were the first to arrive in the formal wood-paneled boardroom. I took my rightful place at the head of the long, polished table. One by one, the 5 members of the board of directors filed in, men Richard had trusted for decades. They were somber, their faces etched with confusion and concern. They greeted me with a respectful deference they hadn't shown in years. When Noah finally arrived, he looked like a ghost. His suit was rumpled, his face was pale and haggard, and his eyes were wide and haunted. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw me sitting in his father's chair, flanked by Arthur, a silent fortress of legal authority. He looked utterly broken before a single word was spoken. I waited until he had taken a seat, and then with methodical calm, I began to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. I simply laid out the facts, each one a nail in the coffin of his lies. Arthur had prepared a binder for each board member filled with copies of the evidence. I detailed the funds he had siphoned into his failed side ventures. I explained the fraudulent loans he had taken out against unencumbered company assets. And for the final exhibit, I had Arthur place 2 documents side by side on the projector for all to see a certified copy of the forged will he had created and the true original will my husband had signed and notarized. The evidence was clinical, irrefutable, and absolutely damning. When I finished, a heavy, profound silence filled the room. The true punishment wasn't my anger. It was the look on the faces of these men who had known Noah since he was a boy. It was a mixture of deep disgust and a sorrow that was almost worse. There was no shouting, no outrage, just the unbearable weight of their disappointment. Finally, Howard Noah's own godfather slowly shook his head, his eyes full of a pain that cut me to the core. He looked at my son and told him that his father's only rule, the one thing he built his entire life on, was that your word is your bond. He said that Noah had betrayed his father and had betrayed them all. In the high-stakes culture of Dallas business, where reputation is everything, this was the ultimate condemnation. It was a social death sentence. Then I delivered the final consequences. I announced my voice clear and steady, that effective immediately, Noah was removed from all positions within the company and stripped of any and all authority. I informed them that Arthur would be filing the real will with the probate court that very afternoon, nullifying the fraudulent document and everything he had done with it. I paused, then tapped the thick binder of evidence in front of me. I told them that this binder and everything in it would be delivered to the district attorney's office by the end of the day. I looked my son in the eye for the last time in that room and told him he had disgraced our name and now he would face the consequences. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the clean, sharp, and unavoidable finality of justice. I had reclaimed my husband's legacy and my own life. It's funny how quickly a city can forget you. 6 months after that final meeting in the boardroom, the fallout had settled into a new, quiet reality. I learned through Arthur that Noah was out on bail awaiting a trial that was sure to be a formality. But in Dallas, the legal verdict was almost secondary. He had already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. He was a pariah. The society pages that had once chronicled his every move now acted as if he had never existed. He had lost everything that ever mattered to him, the company, his status, his so-called friends, and of course his wife. Tiffany had filed for divorce before the ink was even dry on the court documents, eager to sever herself from a sinking ship. I would occasionally hear whispers about their new lives. Someone told me they saw Noah meeting with his public defender downtown. They said he was a ghost of his former self, all the arrogance and charisma stripped away, leaving behind something hollow and humbled. And Tiffany, I heard, was now working as a personal shopper at Neiman Marcus, a desperate attempt to maintain a foothold in the world that had so thoroughly cast her out. There was no quick redemption for them, no dramatic turnaround. There was only the slow, grinding reality of the choices they had made, a quiet and unremarkable price for their spectacular betrayal. I felt no joy in it, only a profound and weary sadness for the son I had lost long before I ever truly knew it. In stark contrast, my own life had bloomed. I stepped into my rightful role as chairwoman of the board. And to everyone's surprise, especially my own, I was good at it. Richard had taught me more than I ever realized. I wasn't just a figurehead. I was a shrewd and respected leader, guiding the company with a steady hand. My personal life, which had been a quiet gray of grief and isolation, was now full of color. I reconnected with old friends. Like Mary, I traveled. I saw the world. Richard and I had always talked about seeing together. And with the company's profits, I started a charitable foundation in his name, funding urban renewal projects and building community libraries in parts of the city that had long been ignored. I was taking the legacy my son had tried to steal and using it to build something that would last. The other evening, I stood on the balcony of the new downtown library our foundation had funded, looking out over the glittering Dallas skyline. The air was cool and clear, and the city lights stretched out before me like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Standing there, I wasn't the vengeful widow or the frail victim my son had tried to make me. I was simply Charlotte, a powerful, and for the first time in a very long time, peaceful matriarch in full control of my life and my husband's legacy. I had taken the worst pain of my life and transformed it into purpose, and I finally understood that true strength isn't about the power you inherit, but about the character you are forced to forge in the fire. In the end, Charlotte's story wasn't just about revenge. It was a lesson in how the deepest betrayals can reveal our most profound strengths. The fire of her son's desperate greed didn't consume her. It forged her into the leader she was always meant to be. She showed that true power isn't found in a will or a bank account, but in the character one builds under pressure. Her greatest victory wasn't just reclaiming an empire, but in proving that the most valuable legacy anyone can protect is their own unshakable strength and purpose.